What's going on, everyone? So, Matthew Lillard talked about Scream 7. So, Matthew Lillard was asked if he's in Scream 7, and he responded with, "No, I'm not in the movie. And even if I was, I would lie direct to your face." This is via GameSpot. So, Matthew Lillard would lie to your face if you asked him if he's in Scream 7, and if he is, wouldn't tell you the truth. Now, look, Matthew Lillard potentially being in the upcoming Scream movie. Look, I'm not, many of you are aware, I am not big on bringing back Stu Macher. I love Stu as a character. I think Stu is one of the most memorable, one of the favorite characters in all of the Scream franchise. I thought what he did has left clearly a resounding, lasting impact on just the fandom and just the history of Scream, period. I mean, so much so, there's a large audience that wants to see Matthew Lillard back. Matthew Lillard as a person, human, a character is an unbelievable one. All we ever see him doing is just spreading joy and committing acts of kindness and stuff, right? You never hear anything bad about him. He is beloved, and rightfully so, right? He should be. However, I think what is done, right? Let that be that. Not everything has to come back. All good things come to an end. And I also have a fear, and we see this a lot with shows and movies and stuff, where you have a character that is so beloved, you have a character that is just so resounding, right? That they bring him back, or her back, and it's not the same. These are different writers, these are different studio heads, this is different everything, right? And the writers for Scream 5 and 6, however you felt about the movies, the writing for Scream 5 and 6, particularly for the legacy characters, has not been great, right? It's almost like they have no idea how to write them in. I mean, Gail and Sydney and Dewey and all of that has not been great as far as the writing goes. My hope is now that Kevin Williamson's back at the helm, that can kind of get things back in order. I also think, in the same breath, outside of the fear, of course, again, the fear of them ruining the character, which is a real possibility. However, again, Kevin Williamson being back, who created the character, has a good understanding for the character. There is the possibility, I think now more than ever, of Stu returning. I think if you were ever going to bring Matthew Lillard back, if you were ever going to bring Stu back, now would be the time to do it, just because you don't have the Sam and Tara story. You don't have all these characters that you need to dive into and explore. Also, you're trying to kind of get the franchise back in order, right? All of the Melissa stuff that happened, I don't want to get into. This is about, Stu and then the Scream franchise moving forward. But you had all that. It's like, okay, well, what do we do, right? So then now they pivot. They go back to Sydney and Gail. Okay, fine. I've talked about, at some point, I think you need to move off of those characters. I think you need to go in a different direction. But I understand, given the circumstances, you needed to get to this point again. Okay, fine. You got me. Let's do it. Give me a good Scream movie. Give me good writing. Give me good storytelling. Because you don't have 15 other characters that you need to introduce as of right now. I mean, obviously that could change. I do think you could potentially get away with Stu Macher. Because the problem with Stu at this point is, by the time this movie comes out, you're talking 30 years of nothing. You have no evidence, you have no discussion, you have no dialogue, you have no scenes, you have no flashbacks, you have literally nothing that Kevin Williams, or that Stu Macher is still alive and in the Scream universe, right? People have their theories and their ideas, and they take certain things and they go, oh, this is evidence, or this is evidence, but none of it is concrete. It's all interpretation. It's all people trying to stretch things. It's all people, he could have survived. Yeah, he could have survived it. No one's saying that, right? No one's saying, good storytelling, good writing, and good execution can answer anything. If they want Stu Macher to come back, could they make it happen? Sure, of course. Could they do it in a good and convincing way? Sure, of course. There is a path and a possibility there. But it would take nearly an entire movie to do so. right? I don't want to see, if they do bring Stu back, I don't want to see Stu back just to have Stu back, right? It's like, oh, here you go, Stu's back, everyone. And it's terribly executed. You don't really get, there's no questions answered, or it's like through like meaningless dialogue, and it's just like, they just kind of try to pass over it, right? I don't want to see that happen. So how do you do it? I think you have to lay the breadcrumbs. I think you have to start the foundation. It's why I've talked about, if you were to bring, because, you know, Scream 6, every Scream movie, there's the wave of Stu returning, right? But the problem is, again, they haven't laid the foundation. If they had laid the foundation in 5 and then a little more in 6, and now we got to this point where it's like, hey, you know what? Like, you know, let's say Scream 5, they spoke on Stu and potentially being alive. Say that's all it was. Just like, you know, Stu Macher being being locked up the last 20 years or however long it's been, right? Like, you know, that is something, right? Okay, well, now you've laid the foundation that he's alive and where he's located. And we know for the last X amount of years, he's been locked up, right? And then, you know, if Scream 6, you kind of made it to where it kind of felt like, or maybe Stu got out or something, or, you know, there was some connection to Stu, and you're kind of laying the breadcrumbs of Stu potentially returning, right? And then now you get Scream 7 and Stu's back. Like, sure, now you, like, if you laid the foundation prior and you started to explain everything over the course of several films, just sprinkled in, then I think you could just bring Stu back. But they didn't do that. So now you have to have not only a story that makes sense for Stu to return, you have to have explanation and justification for where he's been, why he's been there, how long he's been there, what's been going on, why hasn't he mentioned, right? Like, why, like, if he does, let's say he was in prison the last 30 years, right? And he gets out. So the last 30 years, he's just been, what, plotting to get his revenge on Sid? Like, that's a long time to just plot. Especially for something that, like, was you. Like, Stu, yes, was crazy, but he wasn't the mastermind. He wasn't the orchestra. He was the patsy. Right? Like, even Roman said, you know, you gotta get the fall guy. And that's what he tells Billy. And Billy goes and recruits Stu. Like, Stu wasn't this mastermind. Like, that's not, like, so the thing is again, like, now you're trying to paint Stu as this mastermind. It's like, okay, that's fine, but, like, what's the plan? How's the plot? Like, there's just so much you have to unpack. Plus, you got to do Sidney Prescott and her family and Gail and whatever other characters you can introduce. It's just a lot to unpack. And I don't want to see just Stu show up and it's like, okay, well, why is Stu back? And it's like, oh, you know, because he wanted revenge and he's been locked up for 30 years. Like, okay, like, yeah, you explain where he's been, but why hasn't there been any mention? Why haven't we, you know, seen him? Why haven't we heard of him? Like, you know, it's like, no one thought that maybe Stu had connections to anything, especially with Stu. Stu's out and back and killings are happening again, and no one had connections to, hey, maybe Stu was involved with Richie or anything. Like, you know, like, there's no connection being made. Like, why is Stu doing that? Like, that's why I've said I think it makes more sense to do a redemption arc. And I also think it'd be easier to kind of explain and get across than him coming back and being the killer again. I think you could kind of set it up as where he's a red herring and kind of have the twist be like, oh, no, he's actually a good guy. You know, and then you have that dynamic where, like, Sidney's never going to forgive him. You know, Sidney's never going to care for him or anything. And especially if you have a daughter named Tatum, right? Imagine if Stu saved Tatum this time. It's like, you know, you could have the symbolism and all that. It's just, you know, I don't know how you properly answer and solve everything that you need to answer and solve with Stu. I'm sure that there are many Stu fans, Stu diehards, that don't really care. They just want Matthew Lillard and Stu in the films. But Scream has always operated, yes, it's a movie, yes, it has movie logic, yes, it has unrealistic things and stuff, but it's always done a good job of, like, keeping continuity, you know, staying within the realm of realism. Again, there have been unrealistic moments. I mean, even Scream 6, like with Chad, was a little insane, right? Like, there have been things that have been a little over the top, right? But it's hard to just bring somebody back after 30 years. By the time this movie comes out, it'll be 30 years. We haven't even gotten, I mean, we've gotten a mention, like when Dewey was like, oh, it's Stu Macher, right? Like, Outside of that, it was the last time he was like really mentioned in any of the other films. And there's no real like breadcrumbs and tie-ins or anything like that outside of like people trying to justify this or that, or oh, this clearly was Stu. And it's like, it also could have been 15 other things, right? Like, if they wanted it to be that transparent that it was Stu, why not why go through these hoops, right? Like, why not just have it be transparent? You know, like, that's my point, right? Like, again, if they do it and they do it right, fine. You know, like, look, like I said, I'm not going to complain about good execution, good writing, if it makes sense, right? Like, if they do a good story on Stu, sign me up. Cool. But I don't know how they're going to do that. And based on what we've seen with Scream 5 and 6, I don't trust their writing well enough to properly give us what we need for a Stu return. Maybe it happens. And if it does, beautiful. You know, and I know that there's going to be happy. I think that let the past be the past. Let Stu lay where he lay. Let him just be that memory and that enjoyment and all that stuff. And just, you know, let's just keep heading down the direction. Right? It's just, I mean, there's an argument now to move off of Sidney and Gale and all that stuff. Now we're going to bring another, it's just, I don't know. I personally would rather just new, fresh take. I think you're better off having this film be about Sidney and her family and really build around Sidney and her family. Tell some good, interesting stories around Sidney and her family. But those are my thoughts and opinions. And as always, I pass the question on to you. Let me know yours down in the comments below. What do you think? How do you feel? What are your thoughts? Do you agree with my points? Do you disagree with my points? You kind of mixed or in the middle with my points? Again, however you feel, or whatever your thoughts are, I'd love to hear it. So let me know down in the comments below. That being said, if you haven't liked this video, hit that like button. Helps me a lot. Helps me enjoy these types of videos, and I truly appreciate it. Not subscribe to the channel, hit that subscribe button. Turn on the bell notifications. Appreciate y'all. See you in the next one. Thank you.